Female genius.
Hi guys, welcome to this Halloween-ish themed episode of the Female Genius podcast. If you're not watching on video, I am kind of dressed up, okay? I'm dressed up as Clark Kent. I have like a white shirt on and I have the Superman symbol shirt on the bottom. I'm wearing glasses. My hair is tied back. I'm an office worker in disguise, okay? I'm cosplaying. And originally, this was an episode I was going to do weeks ago, but for once in my life, procrastination kind of saved me. And it ended up being a thing of, I don't want to do this one now. And I was like swapping things over. And like technology currently hates me because I cannot for the life of me export any of the videos. I can export audios, but I can't export videos. And I was like, how can I get dressed up for this video and then not do it? So it's just kind of perfectly aligned that this episode is being released on Halloween. And as a Nigerian, I have never celebrated Halloween before. I was telling somebody in lecture today and they burst out laughing, but I'm so serious. I have never gotten dressed up. I've never done anything of the sort. And I'm okay with it. I've made my peace with it. Like, it's not... Okay, no, I haven't. Like, let me do my rant, okay? Obviously, there are a lot of religious connotations that a lot of Nigerians hold when it comes to Halloween, particularly with the dressing up at the trick-or-treat. Like, there's all of the spookiness attached to it. Nigerians, in general, are very superstitious, so they don't like anything spooky. And so it was just always something that was looked down upon. I never went trick-or-treating. I never got dressed up. I never did anything of the sort. And even when I was in uni and I was free to roam around, it was just a holiday that was very skippable to me. None of my friends were really into it. I didn't have any friends that were willing to, like, were so into it that I would get into it. So it was just like a bit of a even this year I thought, okay, this would be my chance to go to a Halloween party, but I'm working really early in the morning to the next day, and so now I'm like, sleep, Halloween party. And for once in my life, I'm actually in a phase where I'm prioritizing sleep. Like, it just doesn't work out, and I feel like my personality is so well suited to spooky season. I don't know why. I feel like if I wasn't raised the way I was, Halloween would be my favorite holiday, because I love books. I love movies and shows and costumes. I love the macabre a little bit. I lean that way. And so I feel like if I grew up differently, with a different perspective towards Halloween, or my parents had a different perspective towards Halloween, it would be the one I would be so excited for. It'd be the thing I'd do parties for, and costume parties. And of course you can hold costume parties any time of year, but guys, it's not the same. Ugh. Anyway, besides the point. Anyway, so in this episode, we are going to be talking about vampires. And this episode was largely inspired by, I was on the internet, as I usually am, and I discovered something so magnificent that it's going to occupy the intro of this episode. And I discovered something called the Journal of Geek Studies, which is basically this non-for-profit website where people submit like detailed studies on really nerdy topics, okay? And I discovered it because I was thinking, like, if vampires like were a real thing, what would be their supposed biology? All of these different... I was kind of curious. I was like, yeah, like, how do vampires really work? And it led me to this paper, and it was so brilliant. I'm going to link it below, and everything I talk about below. So definitely go and check out the Journal of Geek Studies website. I've been raving about it on my social media already. And but yeah, I'm going to be talking a little bit from that. And then I just kind of got curious about vampires in general, how we got here. And then I just thought, you know what? This deserves a Female Genius episode. And I know this sounds weird and very wacky, and to some, it may feel like a skippable episode, but there is no such thing on the Female Genius podcast. So welcome, guys, to this episode of the Female Genius podcast, Spooky Edition.
Female genius.
Before we get into possible theories on how vampires would work if vampires were real, let's think about where vampires kind of entered our social consciousness as a society. And the earliest written references to vampires is thought to be from Slavic folklore, where a creature called the apir was described as a corpse that rose from the grave to drink the blood of the living, which is probably more closer to what you would idealize as like a modern day zombie than, the core seductive Edward Cullen like vampire, right? In Slavic lore, you didn't become a vampire by being bitten by another one. You most likely became it. You were predestined to become one through your action in life or due to the way in which you were died or buried. For example, if you were deemed to be spiritually unclean, a witch, a heretic, ostracized from the church, you are probably more likely to become a vampire than someone else. You died in ways that were quite unsavory, okay, such as being murdered. Again, you are more likely to be, a vampire or become an umpire in the Slavic folklore. And also, if you were given in a proper burial, you were more likely to come back and haunt the villages and the living. And ultimately, in the folklore stories, the umpire's main goal was to torment its family and village. And it was mostly the bringer of plague and illness. And the only way to get rid of the umpire was through cremating, stake through the part, but not really to kill them because they were allergic in modern stories. It was more because if you pin their body to the ground, they couldn't physically get up, or decapitating their head, right? The idea of blood-sucking creatures is something that pervades many different cultures, myths, stories, and legends, and something that we see all the time. Okay, this is not really anything new, right? But the more modern concepts of vampires probably came from a story written by John Polidori titled, accurately, The Vampire from 1819. The story was born in a famous challenge presented by Lord Byron in a villa in Lake Geneva, Switzerland. He presented a group of people, which included Percy Bysshe Shelley and Shelley's future wife, Mary Goodwin, who later became Mary Shelley, to write a ghost story, and this resulted in the creation of two of the most iconic monsters in all of fiction, the vampire, or the modern version of the vampire, and of course, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. John Polidori's story of the vampire was born ultimately out of his frustration from his employer, Lord Byron. The guy hated the dude. Couldn't stand him, okay? And so he wanted to write a monster that was heavily inspired by this man, okay? And so I'm going to give a brief overview of the story. And the story is told from the perspective of a young, wealthy gentleman called Aubrey, who is fascinated by this person, this mysterious Lord Ruthven, who takes extreme pleasure in the ruin of others. Okay, he's just a bad guy, just a really weird off guy. There's nothing really awful, evil, or sinister about him. You just think, damn, he is just a really horrible person. It sucks that he's rich. Okay, Aubrey takes a trip to Greece where he meets and falls in love with a woman called Ianthe. And Ianthe tells him of local legends of creatures called Virocolacus, which is the Greek word for vampire. Soon after their lovely interaction, after Aubrey falls in love, Ianthe is found dead and her throat torn open in ways that very closely matches the descriptions of how vampires kill people. Ruthven suddenly reappears at the scene of the crime and they are attacked by bandits and is extremely wounded. Before he dies, Ruthven makes Aubrey swear an oath to not mention his death or anything he knows about him for 1 year and 1 day, right? Aubrey then returns to London, heartbroken and absolute nervous wreck, okay? And 1 year and 1 day pass. And on the very day the oath expires, he learns that his innocent younger sister, one that he dearly loves, is engaged to be married to a newly arrived nobleman in London who is none other than the mysterious, now extremely sinister Lord Ruthven, okay? Because Aubrey is still bound by this magical oath deadline, he's powerless to tell them anything about Lord Ruthven, his theories about him being a vampire, and cannot stop the wedding. Finally, by the time the oath expires and he is able to reveal the truth, it is too late because Ruthven has vanished, leaving Aubrey's sister dead and drained of her blood. Okay, and this dead plays into creating and constructing the stereotype of the wealthy, rich, manipulative, and seducing vampire. I also find it quite interesting that monsters across fiction are often manifestations of fears that plague society in real life. And whilst I don't think there are any creatures like vampires that existed in prehistoric times, I'd be kind of scared if that was the case, I do believe it's a combination of threats that people at the time those Slavic folklore stories were written were scared of. Those people are probably more scared than you and I of being eaten by a bear or a lion or a massive beast on day-to-day time. So this idea of a blood-sucking creature that kind of looks like a human is terrifying to them. I would also like to point out how interesting it is because the more advanced we become as society, the more we are able to protect ourselves, the more cities we build, right? All of these different things, right? The way in which vampires have been constructed and consumed has changed. This is altered from the fear of being consumed by a large predator to the fear of a two-faced, seducing rich man whore who takes advantage and eats us without us knowing, okay? Binds us with magical spells. The nature in which we construct these monsters truly change. I think you can think about this in the different iterations of Frankenstein across media. It's something that is taken, manipulated, turned around, and used across time, and different other monsters as well. But the vampire is a really good example of this and how we portray, think, and consider this. I often think when I think about this concept of how we view and perceive monsters, I actually look to The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which is a fire Disney movie. I think it's so underrated, but I think it's so underrated because as a kid, you can't get it. There's certain movies you can't get. For example, when I was younger, Wall-E to me was dog shit. Because why am I I remember, like, why am I watching 30 minutes? This guy's picking through trash. Like, I don't get it. The movie's inside it. But now that I'm older, I'm like, oh, I see what you were trying to do with Wally. Do you get what I mean? Or like Inside Out 2, if I watched that when I was 7, I would be like, oh, what a fun movie. Me in the cinema as a 21-year-old bawling my fucking eyes out, okay? And so I think to the Hunchback of Notre Dame and how the real monster necessarily wasn't the one that potentially did not look like others. It wasn't Quasimodo. The real monster in the movie was the person who we would least associate to be the monster. He was the priest. He was the religious leader of the people, right? He looked fine. I wouldn't say he was hot or anything. It was no... Was it the blonde guy in Hunchback of Notre Dame, John Smith? What was his name? John Smith Jr., John Smith adjacent. You could swap them, man. Now I couldn't tell you the difference, okay? Right? But the true monster in the movie was not the one who visually looked like the monster, but was somebody that was riddled with greed, hatred, and prejudice, right? Again, reflecting the fears and the realities of the true monsters that lurk within our society ourselves. That being said, okay, if vampirism was real, and vampires were a real thing, what could potentially be the cause? How could these monsters really exist?
Female genius.
In most modern day adaptations, as I mentioned before, to be turned into a vampire, you had to be bitten by one, okay? And if we use this analogy based off of this is not my own thoughts, guys. Very few things are my own thoughts. Wait, hold on. I do have my own thoughts, but I'm just really want to preface that a lot of these ideas of how vampires and the biology of vampires work, apart from the actual biology that I learned in my degree, but the vampire biology specifically, I got from this paper. You guys need to read it. It's really good. It's so short. It's so accessible. Even if you're not used to reading academic style papers, it's the best thing I've read this year. 10 out of 10. Anyway, so if you were to take this idea that if a vampire bit you, you would get some kind of form of vampiric virus, right? And if we use the biology of real viruses like the paper suggests, we can call the virus like, I don't know, NHV, something vampiric virus, okay? And so if we look a little bit about how viruses are structured, right, they consist of a nucleic acid, which contains the genetic information, which is sometimes DNA or an alternative to DNA, not necessarily alternative, but like an equivalent of DNA, RNA, right? And it has a shell made out of a protein called a capsid. And some viruses also have an outer lipid envelope, which may contain different specific proteins to help attach themselves to potential host cells. So viruses work very similarly to, like, I don't know, your bummy ex-boyfriend, let's say, right? They can't exist on their own, and that's why we can't consider them real living things. Okay, they infiltrate the host cell and hack our cells' machineries, the parts of our cells that make proteins and other things that help us survive, to begin to replicate, to make more of them, to then spread out to other cells. Okay. And so typically what works is they require a very specific surface protein that matches or mimics different proteins on your receptors, or different agonists to your receptors. And by agonist, I mean complementary things. So receptors on your cells kind of work like a lock and key, right? Your receptor has a specific lock and it needs a key that is a specific shape to unlock it. And so by luck of the draw, some viruses have or mimic very closely the key that could unlock the receptor that allows the virus inside to begin hijacking all of your things and your mind and your soul. Okay, I'm joking, but just your cell's machineries, okay? Once they get into your cell, right, and once they get in, they start getting your cells machines to start doing all of the dirty work, making new copies of the virus's DNA, the different structures, the capsids, the protein they want to get out. And they just keep multiplying until your host cells burst open because there's too many of them, and then they die. And that's, cell death. And then they continue doing that. So if you have a cold, for example, this whole process is the cause of many symptoms that we tend to get when we get sick. So if you start having a sore throat, that's just because the viruses are replicating inside of your cells and then bursting out of your cells, killing them in the process and spreading to other cells. But of course, you may ask in this process, where the hell is your immune system in all of this? And it's there. It's trying its best, okay? And it's trying to kick in, and it launches a massive counterattack. I always find it quite funny that when we're talking about immunology and biology, we use such militant language. Attack. You have something called killer cells. Like, one of your white blood cells is called the killer cell. I just think it's so funny, and you could definitely tell, like, a man gave them their names, because what the hell? Anyway, So, right, your body does things like raise your temperature and you get inflammation, you get releases of these chemicals called cytokines, which are like these chemical messengers to your body saying, hey, there's something wrong. We're trying to kick this shit out, to the point where you also start getting other symptoms as a result of your body's immune system trying to fight it. They're like, you know what, like anything doesn't matter. We want to get this thing out. So we're just going to make your life really uncomfortable. Obviously, this is in the context of a cold. Some viruses are detrimental. Okay. So, but how does this relate to how vampires work with our hypothetical NHV virus? Okay, right? Because if you think about all of the different phenotypic changes, that by phenotype, I mean the physical manifestations of the different things in your gene. So, for example, I am brown and beautiful, and that is a phenotypic manifestation of a gene in which codes for me to have more melanin than maybe my ginger white pale counterpart. Okay. So the phenotypic changes that we would associate with vampirism, such as pale skin, sharp teeth, right, a desire and a need for blood, are manifestations of a genetic change induced by this NHV virus. And this paper theorizes is most likely happening by the virus as it enters the cell, is rewriting parts of your DNA and your genes and embedding them in part of your genotype. Okay. They also explore different reasons as to why vampires live so long, how vampires are able to survive on a blood diet, and it's all very interesting. Okay. But one thing I also find more interesting than, like, you know, vampires being allergic to garlic. I'm not saying it's not an interesting thing, but I don't think about it that much. You know what I mean? Is this notion of this idea of why do vampires then live for so long? How can they survive for so long? How can they survive major injuries like Lord Ruthven, or like big massive falls and all of these different things? So as we exist, right, we have our cells that are constantly being renewed and replaced through a process called cell division. However, these are things you can observe in the lab. For example, after a few cycles of cell divisions, right, apart from cancer cells, because they act differently, they're crazy, they stop replicating and die. So after some time, your cells can no longer replicate and renew itself, and hence why you kind of die of old age, or people potentially die of old age if an illness doesn't get them first, right? And on your chromosomes, you have these protective caps, let's say, called telomeres. And basically, they help keep your chromosomes stable over time. However, as you get older and as you continuously divide through generation and generation, these telomeres, these caps get worn down and they decrease in size, and they basically limit longevity because they're no longer robust enough to begin to stabilize your chromosomes in general. But then the question begins to ask, there are some cells that, despite, you know, this kind of limit, okay, of telomeres wearing down over time, such as germ cells. And germ cells are the cells that produce our gametes. And by gametes, I mean sex cells. And by sex cells, I mean sperm and egg, okay? And they need to be able to divide continuously, okay? They need to be able to divide a lot. Like, you can't have these telomeres come in and be like, I'm tired, I'm old. No, they always need to divide. And germ cells actually produce this very special enzyme called telomerase, okay? And this enzyme is present and it promotes the elongation of telomeres in germ cells so that they continue their important cell division forever. Okay, in theory. But everywhere else in the human body, it's inactive. Telomerase doesn't exist. So I would argue, and this paper argues, that the vampires produce something called a Draco telomerase, is which they call it, or begins to force the rest of the body to express some type of telomerase to continue the elongation of telomeres to allow vampires to live for that long, right? There are so many different studies going on in different areas of science, particularly the area of science of aging called senescence, to see if this is something we can look at to extending the longevity of human life. There have been many studies, for example, in genetically engineered mice to force them to begin to always express high level of telomerase all over the body. And these mice showed to live 40% longer than normal mice, and they were healthier too. They also attempted this same study, rather than genetically engineering a mice and like birthing mice that just produce high levels of telomerase, they genetically engineered and injected telomerase into already old or aged mice, right? They used a virus to deliver this telomerase gene and got embedded into the mouse genome. And so then they begin to express telomerase everywhere. Okay. And it did show reverse of aging, and it did show those mice lived considerably longer than their control group. However, there is a massive, massive reason as to why scientists haven't gone ahead and looked at this in terms of human cases, because there is a massive unspoken risk. Your body is so intelligent, okay? It's so fucking smart. It's beautiful, okay? Not to be like that weird nerdy scientist, but honestly, like, everything that you think, why does my body not do that? Or why does my body not do this thing? There's a very, very good reason. And I said I'd come back to cancer cells because I'm back, okay? The whole reason why your body does not produce telomeres everywhere is because it's basically your body's fail-safe to try and really stop cancer, okay? Your body suppresses telomeres as a primary defense against uncontrolled cell division, right? For a cell to become cancerous, okay, it needs to be able to continue dividing forever. AKA, we can't, if a precancerous cell was to get access to telomerase, which actually I think is around 90% of human cancerous cells, reactivate the production of telomerase within the cell so it can continue dividing forever. If they do get that opportunity to divide forever, you will probably get lots of tumors, okay? Hence why in a lot of these studies, cancer risk is extremely high, and this limits the potential to translating it from like, you know, cell models or animal models to human studies, okay? My hypothesis into how this links to how vampires are able to exist and why the idea of cancers aren't an issue in vampires is because cancer cells dividing, or the process of cell division, requires a lot of energy and a lot of metabolic resources. So we see in different, you know, cell models or animal models that cancer cells take a lot of glucose, okay? They consume a lot of energy because division is a metabolically expensive process, okay? But given the fact that vampires' primary source of food is blood, which is ultimately not very rich in many nutrients, it's not a good food source, like point blank period. Like it's not great. And because obviously vampires' metabolisms are extremely slowed, I don't think cancerous cells are in a good environment or do not get enough metabolic nutrients to survive. So despite there being telomerase, and despite the fact that yes, these cells can continue to divide forever, it does not manifest into potentially dangerous disease-causing tumors in vampires. This is my theory. So look at this, guys. We've learned about how potentially vampires spread, you know, most likely through a virus. And also, this is the thing, with viruses, you either survive or you don't. You either sink or you swim. And so it kind of makes sense, that whole thing. If you watch Vampire Diaries, it's like a massive thing that like sometimes people, it's also a thing in Twilight. They have vampire venom. That's something different. Let's not go into that. But like, it's like if you get bitten by a vampire, like you either die because you can't handle the vampire virus, like your body just, or like you change and you become a vampire. So I think it's just that, like, either your body is able to like change, adapt, adjust, and like, you know, handle the new genetic information and, you know, express those phenotypes in ways that aren't damaging, or your human body can't keep up with it. But look at us, we've learned so much from exploring the earth. This is why I think people always laugh, okay? And not laugh, but I think people don't take certain things seriously. I remember when I was practicing my Cambridge interviews, or like my interviews for university, and I remember a teacher asking me, like, what genuinely, like in school, like, what genuinely got you interested in science? I was like, I'm dead ass, it was superheroes. I'm dead ass, like, I was like, all of my favorite superheroes are scientists or explore scientists, and all of these different things they're doing have this underpinning in science, okay? And I was just so fascinated by it. And okay, while we don't have a superhuman walking around, well, potentially conspiracy theory, but while we don't have people zooming around and doing all of these crazy different things, all right, or, you know, being able to live forever or become the Hulk, or all of these different things that superheroes do, right? These are gateways to begin questioning things about our science. Like all of these different questions I had or kind of came to learn about telomeres and telomerase was born out of my really weird not fantasy, but my really weird desire to figure out, okay, but if vampires were real, how could they work? Like, what does that work? What does it tell us about our human biology? What does it make us appreciate about our own human biology? And how can we continue to explore this within science, within labs, within movies, within culture? It's just so amazing. And yeah, so that's why I'm so obsessed with the Journal of Geek Studies. I don't know who I need to email. I would love to interview anybody from the Journal of Geek Studies. Like, who do I fucking email, okay, to get them on this podcast? Because I genuinely think things like that and things that contextualize our science and all of the things we learn and things that genuinely bring us so much joy and entertainment in various forms is just the best way to consider thinking and growing and evolving and innovating and learning, so we don't have AI robots take over our world. Because, you know, we've watched I Am Robots. We're like, yeah, this might be our limit. Anyway.
Female genius.
I can sit here and nerd about, you know, telomeres and aging and senescence all day. I spend so much of my day thinking about science now that I feel like now I just speak in science mumbo jumbo. And I'm happy about it, but it's been a while, okay? But while we can learn about the different potential ways vampires could potentially exist and what it could teach us about our fear and our inevitable mortality, right? Vampires have really changed, okay? Like we talked about this notion of vampires being really blood-sucking, scary creatures to transition into being, seductive, wealthy people that transcend time to now being hot, romantic, sincere interests, okay? Interests and people that don't get fear traps, they get thirst traps. Okay. And vampires kind of are now positioned in a place where you fall in love or they're really humanized. And it's a little bit of a kink because of the rise of shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Vampire Diaries, and what I would argue one of the most culturally impactful pieces of modern media, Twilight. And how could I do a vampire episode and not go into detail Twilight? Now, some people hear Twilight, they roll their eyes. Some people have heard me say Twilight and they get really excited. No matter what field you lie on, Twilight was a cultural phenomenon unlike anything else, okay? I remember I was really young when Twilight first came out, so it missed me. And I'm deeply upset about it. But I deeply remember making fun of my older sister because she was obsessed. Because she was in the age range. She read all the books. She went to the cinema to watch all of the movies. It was it birth throat. She was here talking to me about Edward versus Jacob. Like I gave a shit. I give a shit now. God, like there's so many things I'm so upset. Because we don't fandom right anymore. This is such a separate rant. We don't fandom right anymore. Okay, recently on TikTok, people have been making cross movie, cross TV show, cross medium shipping. And I feel like we're coming back to, our ancient texts, okay? Being a fan, like the era of nonchalance is dead, and I'm so fucking glad. Because when did it become cool to not like things? Like genuinely, I feel like I could make a TikTok about it. Can you see I'm like itching and scratching myself if we're watching on video? Like I wish, like, oh my God, to be in the prime era where Hunger Games was releasing, you were reading and waiting for each book. And then the movies came out. And you were read like okay, I did catch like the last end of the Hunger Games. I think I might have been 10 or 11 when the Catching Fire came out. When did Lord release? I was like 10, 11, 12. Like I was around that age, but still, if I was 17, oh my God, the first Divergent. Like there's just so many things I just feel like we don't fandom properly. We don't collectively organize as a community to fan. Okay, and I think that's why Twilight. I don't think we could ever have something like Twilight again. We can never have that kind of cultural impact of a movie like that again. And I watch Twilight every year like clockwork. Okay, it's like it's something I do with my friends. It's kind of hilarious, it's kind of funny, but it's also like kind of magical to witness and watch what everybody watched in real time. You can watch it as a comedy, you can take it absolutely seriously. You could take it so seriously that you go like read AO3 fan fiction about different me. Also, by the way, okay, I was talking with my friend Nicole because she's read all of the Twilight books, and she was telling me that Stephanie Meyer's, first of all, I was kind of curious, like, what's my goal? Like, like usually when a famous author like has done so well and they're like writing other series, they either continue writing that series dick until forever, or they like write new different books and different stories, and they they continue developing different worlds, so on and so forth. She wrote a gender, like honestly, I was like, did she really write this, or is this like Wattpad fan fiction? She wrote a gender bender of Twilight, which is basically the exact same Twilight story, but Bella is now Beau, Edward is now Edwina, and Jacob is Jules. And it's just gender swapped, and it's published, and you can buy it. And Nicole was saying Loki, word for word, it's pretty much identical. But late stage capitalism, anything for a fucking check. But anyway, so vampires in Twilight are hot, okay? They're not scary, okay? Vampire Diaries, they're hot, okay? They're physically superior than human beings in every single way. And there's a seductiveness to them, okay? Particularly in relationships with non-vampires, okay? And I can kind of see, or like, let's think about where this attraction comes from. So I can kind of get it, okay? Edward has to physically restrain himself. Like, he can't hold him back from the one person who could potentially accept and understand him and see him for who he really is, okay? See his humanity, okay? This idea of physically tampering down his physical drives because his love for Bella conquers his need to suck her blood. It's in crazy. And it's not necessarily about this like idea of loving a beast or a monster, but it's seeing the humanity in the supposed monster and then embracing that for you. Okay. Somebody was at work, actually, because I talk about Twilight a lot. Like, it's honestly, it's like one of my personality traits. It's a bit sad. But we were talking about at work, and somebody was explaining to me how the vampires in Twilight are like this massive allegory for like chastity and love and not having sex before marriage, like restricting and withholding somebody's self. And I find this concept quite interesting and a little bit baffling. Like, not the idea of chastity, I think is okay. But me personally, if I was a 500-year-old vampire doomed to live forever, I would have cracked year 32. I wouldn't even make it to 50. Like, what are you talking about? Like, also, what are you talking about? I also will not get into how weird it was that he waited for a 17-year-old, and that was the person in 500 years that let him break his chastity. But that does not deny, like, all of my criticisms does not deny the impact. I mean, first of all, it's a cinematic masterpiece. That baseball scene, like, even from a cinematic, like a making perspective, like a filmmaking perspective, at the time it was made, like, now to us, it just looks basic. But at the time it was made, some of these special effects, like the running, like the color grading of the film, the soundtrack, guys. I still listen to Paramore Decode to this day. Honestly, in my Spotify Wrapped, I think Decode is gonna be there. That's how much I listen to it, okay? Because it was covered in Maggie Lindbergh's album, and I was like, wait, like, I need to hear Hayley Williams sing Decode one more time to me. The soundtrack, like, everything about it and how it just entered cultural phenomenon was just it seeped and it exploded, okay? Um, Anyway, right? And then, you have like Vampire Diary. Like, there's so many iterations of vampires now. And obviously the most recent one, and another phenomenal example of filmmaking, Sinners. And I say filmmaking specifically because obviously Ryan Coogler did that whole 10-minute spiel about why you need to see the movie in IMAX. And I paid that £10 extra and I saw that movie in IMAX. And I was like, yeah, he ate. And I listened to every single possible podcast on the making of that film, particularly like that one scene. Okay, nobody thinks about this until they like think about it. But obviously Michael B. Jordan's playing two characters, like Liv and Maddie style. He's playing twins. But if you watch Liv and Maddie, you will notice that like they're never in the same direct shot and they never touch each other in a way where you can see both of their faces at the same time. Okay. But in Sinners, they you can see both of them and they hand each other a cigarette. And you might think this is so light, like, graphed it, Photoshop, but no, like, cinematic wise, and that level of continuity for like one tiny scene was so impactful. And Ryan Coogler was saying in an interview that scene was so important because it establishes and it really reinforces subconsciously in your mind that these are two separate characters, because they're like, they may look the same, but they're two separate characters in different man. Honestly, guys, Oscar season is coming soon, and if Sinners gets nothing, you guys are all doomed and will be punished to an entire 2-hour podcast episode as to why Sinners was robbed. Okay, it's like when The Weeknd did not get any Grammy nominations for After Hours. That's how I will feel if Sinners gets subbed at the Oscars. Okay, anyway, but what was I saying? Sinners, again, like, that representation, they really pull from like really really old folklore and stories from the old folklore, and that's explored and expressed in the film. They play on certain stereotypes, but they lean away from this, let's say, seductive nature of vampires, and they kind of look at the seductive nature of humanity in of itself. And like, what is, like, these vampires, like, yes, they're evil, but also we feel things for them. Like, we feel like, Remnick is the bad guy, but you feel bad for Remnick. Like, this, I'm waffling. I don't think I'm still not over Sinners to the point where I can correctly express very apt and intelligent opinions about it. But again, vampire media is constantly evolving, and it's something that we will continuously come back to. In the same way we keep coming back to Frankenstein's monster, and the same way we keep coming back to fucking zombies, we will keep coming back to vampires. Okay. We will. Because the thing about our society and our culture and where we are now in terms of like consuming like stories and storytelling is we're in the era where we no longer have myths and legends, but we create fictional tales that reflect what society looks and feels and wants to feel. about ourselves and humanity and what they want to recognize and explore. And the easiest and the most safe and comfortable playground to explore it is in fictional worlds. And these monsters that create and that sleep underneath children's bed and occupy our pages in our books are ways in which we can continue to interact and explore morality, the meaning of being human, and the meaning of what good and bad is and where those lie. Our vampires now aren't clear and cut bad people or bad, creatures just as a result of their biological functions of being creatures. There are good vampires, there are bad vampires, there are vampires in between. I mean, the humanity switch in Vampire Diaries, we could do a whole episode about this. We will be doing a whole mini episode about this now that I put it on top of my head. But again, vampires, as much as I can have fun and I can freak out about it, again, these monsters in fiction tell us so much about ourselves as humans and the way you interact with them, the way you feel about them, the way you want to love them, the way you want to dislike them. The way, maybe my Nigerian dad might shy away from watching a vamp. No, my dad, he loved Sinners. He was so in Sinners. But maybe like my Nigerian grandma would hate to watch a vampire movie because, it instinctively, triggers like certain fears in her in terms of superstition and religiosity. But now it's, again, like a playground to interact with all of those different things like I mentioned before. But anyway, guys, I hope you have an amazing November. Guys, it's almost the end of the year. Guys, I hate, you know what, we're not going to talk about this now. I was just going to go into a whole spiel about like how I love and hate the end of the year. But like December, I go nuts. Like, don't be surprised if I have a video being like, okay, let me tell you about my Cambridge situationships, okay? Because I go nuts because December doesn't exist to me. December is like writing things in pencil that I erase in January because new year, new me. So be excited for that. And anyway, guys, I will see you next time on the Female Genius podcast.
Female Genius.